Well, in today's world, peace appears a distant dream. As the second anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine approaches on Saturday, conflicts in the Middle East daily make the headlines, and more than 20 other pockets of conflict, crisis, and instability exist in Africa, Asia, South America, and other parts of the world. We're grateful you have chosen to join us for the Keston Spring 2024 panel, Seeking Peace in Times of War, Hope or Hopeless, and this timely discussion. I'm Kathy Hillman, Director of the Keston Center for Religion, Politics, and Society at Baylor, which is located on the third floor of Carroll Library if you haven't been to see us yet. Hopefully after this you will. Perhaps you're wondering what Keston is exactly and why Baylor. The Keston Institute was founded in 1969 in England by the Reverend Canon Dr. Michael Bordeaux, an Anglican priest. 10 years earlier, in 1959, as an Oxford University student, Michael took part in the first exchange between Great Britain and the Soviet Union. Think about that. While studying at Moscow University, he witnessed the start of Nikita Khrushchev's anti-religious campaign. On a later visit, Michael saw further destruction of churches, learned of religious persecution, and met believers who asked him, quote, to be our voice where we cannot be heard. Bordeaux took up their call to be the voice of the voiceless, and with others, including one of today's panelists, Xenia Dennen, established the Center for the Study of Religion and Communism, later known as Keston College or Keston Institute. Keston gathered reliable information about the situation with all religions and documented the persecution and fight by dissident believers in the countries of the now former communist bloc and other totalitarian regimes. A vast library and unique archive formed Keston's core, and the Keston News Service produced authenticated reports that exerted positive political pressure. With the breakup of the Soviet Union, the organization experienced a decline in donations. In 2003, the news service ceased, and the search began for a location for Keston's stunning collection on religious persecution and religious freedom that included not only books and periodicals, but photographs, significant archival and audiovisual items, illegally published materials known as samizdat, propaganda posters, art, trial transcripts, and much more, written in at least 33 languages and encompassing more than 30 discrete religions and denominations. Oxford's Keston Institute accepted Baylor's proposal, thanks to Wallace Daniel, who is here with us this afternoon. And in 2007, passed its library and archives to the newly created Keston Center to work with Keston UK to preserve the resources and promote research, teaching, and understanding of religion and religious persecution under communism and other totalitarian regimes, and to continue to be the voice of the voiceless. Seeking peace in times of war, hope or hopeless, is part of Keston's legacy that today includes those affected by war and persecution. Dr. David Smith, Senior Lecturer in History, serves as today's moderator. A prolific writer and speaker, he has served as a Fleet Professor of Strategy and War at the U.S. Naval War College. Named Outstanding Professor on numerous occasions, Smith writes and hosts a weekly art, culture, and history show on KWBU. Dr. Smith.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much to all of you for being here. This is, I'm always thrilled to be in an event like this when extra chairs have to be brought out, and that does a body good. I was leaving my office to come over here just about an hour ago or so, and one of my colleagues stopped me on the way out and said, do you know that today is National Margarita Day? And I hadn't known this. And my initial thought was, my initial thought was I'm buying the wrong calendars, clearly. as an American historian, I know this to be George Washington's birthday. The old boy would be pushing up something like 294 years old this year. But it's not inappropriate for us to be talking about issues of war and peace, because those questions dominated his life. When he was a young man, when he was a middle-aged man, and when he was president, he faced questions of war and peace constantly, and was always preoccupied with how to get from war to peace. When he was president, he said of the United States, he said, "Our distant and detached condition invites us to pursue a different course," thinking about the wars that were engulfing Europe in the 1790s. And I think, I was thinking about this on the way over, I think we all, when faced with war, dream of a different course. I think we all, whether we're in it or whether we're just witnesses to it somewhere in the world, our reaction as humans has to be, there's got to be something better than this. There's got to be a different course. And when wars seem to press on us from every side, we wonder if there's a hope for that. Now, I have the honor of sitting up here and listening to these incredible people talk about this question. I'm going to introduce them briefly, starting here to my right. And then, after I introduce them all, I'll ask them to just maybe give a little bit of an opening statement from their own point of view. I'll give you an idea of what their point of view will be. And then we'll just dive in. And we don't have a script. We don't have any idea how long this is going to go. We've blocked out 8 hours, I think. So we'll be ready. We'll send out for pizza if we have to. To my right is George Njung. He is a colleague of mine in the history department. He also teaches in the Baylor Interdisciplinary Corps. He is a PhD in history from the University of Michigan. He's been at Baylor since 2022. Is that right? And he specializes in the effect of war on the African continent. He's written extensively about the Nigerian Civil War. He's written about how World War I influenced Africa and African people, and he's written about political stresses today in places like Cameroon. And he brings such a vibrant angle to any discussion of war and peace. To his right is Joanne Cummings, and she is in the BIC. She teaches in the BIC and in the poli-sci department. And I have a particular affinity for these two because I taught in the BIC for a long time, long before you ever even got here. But she is also a State Department career servant, and she has been all over the world, especially in what we would call the Middle East. She finished high school in Iran, I heard, and she went to the American University in Beirut, which I learned today she ranks among the most beautiful campuses in the world. And your description made me want to go see it. But she has served in diplomatic posts from Yemen to Egypt to Israel to Afghanistan. She has counseled and advised military commanders throughout the CENTCOM area of responsibility, facing war and peace and unrest every place from Iraq and to Afghanistan. To her right is Vladimer Narsia. He is a Fulbright Scholar in Residence from St. Philip's College down in San Antonio. He holds a teaching position in the university in the Republic of Georgia. So my reaction when I met him today was, is the weather like this in February in Georgia? And I can't imagine that it would be. But it's wonderful to have him here. He's written extensively on issues of religion and conflict and religion and state in Georgia. He's got law degrees from universities in Tbilisi and in Cardiff in Wales. And I'm very excited to ask him particular questions about how a state like Georgia interacts with great powers surrounding it and putting pressure on it from the outside. not unlike something that George could comment on as well, right? Xenia Dennen is someone I just met today, and well, I just met all these people today, incredibly enough. But it's wonderful to have you here, and meeting and talking to you has made me understand why everyone talks so highly of you. She's a native of Liverpool. She went to Oxford and got degrees in Russian and French, and she has an interest in Russian culture and history that was passed down from your grandmother. Is that right?
Great-grandfather, great, yeah, they go back.
It goes back a ways.
End of the 18th century to the end of the 19th century. I had all these relations who were in Russia.
And shortly after she graduated, she began working, like you heard, with the institute, the efforts that would grow into what we know of as today the Keston Institute, right here on campus. And I think I would like to start with you, if you don't mind. If you could give us just a brief overview of what you think of when you look at the world today in terms of war and peace and hope.
Well, I'm very, very ancient. I'm actually a war baby. And I remember well, my dad was one of the commanders of the Battle of the Atlantic, and that's why I was born in Liverpool. I remember all the bomb sites. Is it not? Close.
Put it up to your mouth.
Closer. Is that the right position? Like that? Okay, can you hear? Okay, just so, I'm very aware of the Second World War, and I remember rationing. And then my involvement with Russia. I was banned in 1976. I was only able to go back in 1992 after the fall of communism. And it was, I suppose, one of the greatest joys of my life to go to a country where I had been unable to talk to people for so many years. Suddenly, after Gorbachev had totally changed the situation in the Soviet Union and the Eastern Europe, I could speak to other human beings on the street freely. It was an absolute joy. And I just want to read to you, because I've been reading this book, rather preparing for today, because I'm so deeply, deeply saddened by the fact that I can't go to Russia anymore, that so many people are being killed, that Russian culture is being cancelled. It really breaks my heart. And this book is called The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. But I just want us to remember Gorbachev and what an extraordinary person he was, how we actually need another Gorbachev today. This is what he wrote in 1987, just during Perestroika. Civilization has approached a dividing line, not so much between different systems and ideology, but between common sense and mankind's feelings of self-preservation on the one hand, and irresponsibility, national selfishness, prejudice, to put it briefly, old thinking on the other. What matters now is that we cannot let these opportunities pass and must use them as fully as possible to build a safer and more democratic world, free from the trappings and the psychology of militarism. So that is the reason why I'm feeling so sad today. All that he did, all the transformation, the end of the Cold War, we're now in the middle of a second Cold War, and I hope somehow there is another Gorbachev.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. Yes, my name is Vladimer Narsia. I'm in profession, I'm a theologian, religious study, and I'm a church lawyer. Well, talking about the country, which is Georgia, this relatively small country and surrounding of the giant empires, historically the Ottoman, Persian, and Russian Empire, it is not an easy task. Georgia is a country which is independent now but this is, I think, most important to say that this is not easy for the government to cope with the lots of challenges and the problems that we have today. And this is, of course, the reason because the religion plays a decisive role in my country and probably in the countries where the post-communist, post-Soviet bloc countries belong. This is a huge influence still over the religion and the religious institutions in Georgia. And the Georgian Orthodox Church got lots of pressure by the Russian Orthodox Church. Why I'm saying this is the reason is that we need to understand when we are talking about the small country like Georgia, how important is the religion in my country, and how important is to just look at all the problems that my country and all the regions they have from the lens of religion. So this is a most important issue now in Georgia to just get freed from the influence of the Russian state, of the Russian history of legacy. And this is a two main institutions. This is a church and one side, and the another side is a state. And this is the most important one for me to just speak about how this the trouble has been just taken in my country over the centuries, because in the 19th centuries at the beginning, Russia abolished the orthocephaly of the Georgian Orthodox Church, and they are staying now up to now in the church, and we have lots of problems for that reason. Thank you.
Shall I use this one?
Let's try.
Does this work? Yeah. All right. I love this so much. Some of you may know I had my granddaughter around campus the last couple of days, and you know she always had a snuggly, so now I kind of feel I do too. I want to take this in a slightly different direction or bring a different perspective to what we're talking about, because we tend to view war and peace in very sort of classical geopolitical terms. We have states, and states are in a state of war with each other, and if they're not in a state of war, then we call that peace, unless we call it a Cold War. And how that relates to peace is still an open question. What I want to do is step away from that and look at it more from the perspective of people themselves. Because we can say Russia is at war in Ukraine, Russia invaded Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine are at war, but what do people feel on the ground? There are people who feel themselves to be at war when their countries are not. There are people who feel themselves to be at peace or relatively secure when their countries are at war. There are people in Russia who do not feel themselves to be at war, even though the country is. So what I would like to do is to raise for you a question of the experience of people as opposed to the policies of state, which may sound weird because I spent my entire career working on the policies of state. But it made me very aware that on the ground, nothing is sustainable unless people feel that their fears have been comprehended and have been mitigated. As long as people remain afraid any sort of political resolution or military resolution is going to, in the long run, be unsuccessful. Thank you.
When I was told that this is a speaker microphone, I had my doubts.
It's fun though, isn't it?
Now that Joanne has used it, I think my doubts have been cleared. So I'll speak, in a context, and within the context of my expertise. If you were to just Google United Nations Refugee High Commissioner for Refugee to sort of get some statistics about global displacement, you would be stunned to find that there are, as of today, over 100 million human beings displaced across the globe. And that the vast majority of that number, that displacement has resulted from some form of armed conflict or outright war. So that is to sort of stress or emphasize the magnitude of what was in the late 20th and early 21st century are capable of doing. Now I'm going to zoom down to Africa specifically. So I'm from Cameroon, which is Central African region. And Cameroon is a sort of bilingual country, has a dual history whereby about 80% of the country was formerly under the French colonialism. And then the other 20% was formerly under the British. And that's the region where I come from. And that, out of a population of about 25 million people in Cameroon, the region where I come from has about 6 million people. There has been war raging, a civil war raging in Cameroon since October 1916, which has affected mostly the region where I come from. And out of a population of less than 6 million people, that war has displaced more than 2 million. So that is over 30%. And many of them are sort of scattered all over within the country and then across neighboring countries, including Nigeria, of course. My mother died in January 2019 at the age of 80, and I was unable to go home and bury her because it wasn't safe for me to go home. Now, this is just a Cameroon situation. Now, if you move further from Cameroon, which is in Central Africa, further into West Africa, you probably would have heard of a region that is known as the Sahel region, where the French have been very, very present for as long as I can remember. And the Sahel region has also been very much sort of wrecked, in the very serious conflicts that are happening within that region. And many of these conflicts, although of course they have been happening since the 1960s, when colonialism was sort of packing its bags and going home, but it's sort of kind of assumed different magnitude since 2011. And momentarily, I would explain why is it that it is from 2011 that the situation has spiraled out of control. Now, if you move away from the Sahel region and then you move further to the Lake Chad region, Central African Republic is a small country of about 5 million people, which is also sort of bedeviled by a war, by a civil strife that has displaced, as of June last year, has displaced 1.1 million people out of a population of 5 million people. Now, the story goes on and on. If you go to further into Central Africa, you probably would have heard of the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. There is war happening in the eastern part of the country of course, which has been going on for decades. Now, these are like full-scale wars that are happening, and this doesn't include things like temporary sort of military coups that some sort of destabilize the political landscape, for maybe a temporary amount of time, could be a couple of days or weeks or months. And I just give you an example. From August 2020 to September 2023, as many as about 20 military coups had happened only within the Sahel region, West Africa alone. So that sort of gives you an idea of the situation, that of the over 100 million people who are displaced, the vast majority of them displaced as a result of war, the Middle East and Africa sort of rank very top within that scale.
It occurs to me as we talk, and as you represent these different angles to this major question of war, one can sort of approach war from either the state's perspective or a human perspective. And I don't know anyone who is really, really fluent in doing both of those things. There's this notion that you can analyze war as something that states do in history, right? And you say this war was started over this war was started this. Or you can step back and just look at the human cost of it and then think, these are not states that are bleeding and dying, these are human beings. How do we get past that fractious nature of war? Is there a way to think about it more holistically that would make us understand it better?
That is a great question. I think there's something that religion can say to just how to achieve the more peaceful society and how to just defeat the something like the problems that people have, or just the cause of the war. I would probably go to the example now to just show up how the religion historically in Russia just creating the kind of ideology of the third Rome or Eurasianism, or that recently the Holy Russia, and how those concepts just provoking the troubles that almost every single cases the Russian state is making for the history and in the context of the Ukraine-Russian war. And I think this is most important aspect, that the religion can be freed or must be freed from politics. And in that sense, I think religion can say something very important to promote the peace and the peace-building process. That is my hope probably is that one day the church and the hierarchies which we know and we are witnessing is a couple of times now very primates of the Russian Orthodox Church is supporting the military aggression in Ukraine. And I don't think that helps the people and the mutual understanding and dialogue or peace-building process. That is wise words. I would say that the religion has a different mission, and this is I want to just stress. Yeah, thank you.
And there are many, just going to the I'm deeply shocked at what the Moscow Patriarch Kirill is saying, and this teaching about the Russian world. It is a total travesty of the Christian faith. However, there are many believers, Orthodox believers. I won't talk about the Protestants, I'm just talking about the Orthodox at the moment, as Vladimer was discussing that. We know of clergy who are anti-war, who are refusing to pray the prayer for Russian victory. And Father Alexei Uminsky, the most authoritative priest in Moscow, has just recently been defrocked and removed, with thousands of people writing appeals for him to be reinstated. There are a lot of people who are not supporting this war. As for Russian propaganda, I'm afraid many are taken in by what is told by the Putin regime. But just to defend the church, Kirill the Patriarch does not represent the whole body of Orthodox believers. And I know amongst the Protestants, they're being very careful, keeping their heads low, having had their experience of persecution as a minority faith. They're very afraid of putting their head above the parapet, although one of them, Pastor Sipko, has indeed spoken out, he's a Baptist pastor, has spoken out very strongly against the war. So sorry, just filling in a bit on the religious background.
Certainly so, yes.
I think in this context, it's useful to look at, in terms of the linkage between governments, people, and the experience of people, the practice that is prevalent across the world and across time of creating enemies. So I spoke of fear as being a limiting factor in achieving a sustainable peace. It's also a very useful tool for maintaining either a state of war or the power of the government. Because when you have an enemy, you do have, as political scientists like to say, a rally round the flag effect. We must stand together against the enemy. The problem is that once one does that, once that is done by a government, that fear tends to be self-perpetuating. It is very difficult to undo. So if it continues to serve the government, and you might argue the state, then it can be useful that you don't have to put a lot of effort into keeping it going. I don't know, can you talk about political rents there? But if you're trying to make a change, then it can be much more difficult to undo that distrust, that essentialization of another people, whether it's based on ethnicity, religion, race, or something else. So I do think that the relationship between state and people can be conceived in that particular nexus, among others.
Sure.
Right. So, I mean, I'm going to respond to that question the way that historians typically respond to questions of that nature. Thinking about wars as to whether they're sort of state-generated or they are people or individual sort of focused phenomenon. I think the wars that we have in the 21st century are a fallout of the state-making processes, the state-making processes, and the issue of nationalism, which is sort of tends to be exclusive rather than inclusive, which is one of the things that distinguishes nation states from the business of empire. Although, of course, they also do have their variations. But in the case of Africa, to be very specific, the wars that have bedeviling much of African landscapes today, you would have to look at the trajectory of decolonization. And then you would have to interrogate the nature of decolonization of the African continent. What sort of relationship did Africa have with the West that colonized the continent as from the last quarter of the 19th century? And what sort of relationship did the West sustain with the continent on departure? And so I often look at the wars in Africa as a continuum, and I look at them as part of the failure of the process of decolonization. Of course, we could talk, if you wanted to go into multiple causes, then we might start to talk about issues such as neocolonialism, which sort of defines the relationship between former colonial powers and the former colonies in Africa. We would also want to talk about issues of resources. One scholar recently described the wars that are happening in Africa as the battle for the soul of Africa, by which he means the battle for the resources of the continent. And so you have these sort of international metrics. In almost all the wars that happen in Africa, whether from the Sahel region, whether from the Central African region, whether in the Sudan, whether in the Eastern Congo, there is an international metrics to that war. So you could almost explain the war looking at, global international mechanisms that would explain those wars even more than the internal mechanisms.
Yeah. When you mention nationalism and when you mention nationalism and war, I automatically think about the drawing of borders. And this is the case in almost any place there is war today. Lurking behind the question of war is the question of a border and where this land begins and where this land stops. Is there a way that our understanding of borders as borders can enlighten us to why war happens? Is there a more natural way of conceiving of borders that would lead to less war?
Can I do that?
You,
I'm a geographer. This is my thing. First, except for countries that end at the edge of a sea, there are no natural borders. Mm-hmm. There just are none. Borders are where people stopped fighting, historically. European borders are not more natural than borders anywhere else. They were just defined by powerful people longer ago. So when we look at areas that were colonized, yes, the borders are artificial in the sense that they were not established by the people who were there for their own reasons because it made sense. They were established for other reasons. But the reasons that borders were established in Europe because dynasties were at war and managed to stop at a certain line, it was long enough ago so that communities have developed different senses of identity. But we still have conflicts in Europe. Shall we talk about the Balkans? The Middle East is not inherently more warlike than Europe. Europe, for many, many centuries, was having lots more conflict than the Middle East was. Africa has had periods of great prosperity and great growth and great strength. So we need to avoid looking at now as the only pattern that there is. That said, when colonial powers drew borders in order to create the weakest possible entity, they often succeeded. Libya is an example.
Yeah.
And the question of borders is highly relevant, of course, to Ukraine. It means in Ukraine, at the border. It is an extraordinary thing, but the Russian view is, or the official view is, that Ukraine has no separate culture. It was part of the Soviet Union, that border really wasn't a reality. There is only one, the teaching of the Russian world is there is one people, the Belarus, the Ukrainians, and Russians. So I think border is highly relevant to the current war. And many families in that part of Eastern Europe are interrelated. I mean, the number of people I know who have got a Ukrainian mother and a Russian father, the two. And then this fuss about the language, it's absolutely natural for a Ukrainian to be able to speak Russian. And unfortunately, it's been banned. Russian is now banned as an official language. It was an unnecessary division to make, because I think Ukrainians, all the ones I know, certainly speak Russian quite easily. So borders very relevant to the current war.
I think that it's a very important question. In religion, in Christian theology, there is this word is a Greek word called the ethnophiletism, or ethnophiletism. The meaning is when the religious doctrine merged to the national concepts, that is which was condemned by the church council of the Orthodox churches. The point why I'm saying this is that they recently, the Patriarch Kirill announced that this is very important war in Ukraine, because all is going to die in the war will be the saint of the Russian nation. So this is kind of heresy from the perspective of the Christian teaching, and I think this is a very deep root, that this understanding of the heresy that the Russian hierarchy produced and creates, the deep understanding is a concept of the Eurasianism. The Eurasianism is a kind of concept which creates a holy Russia on the basis of the holy nation of Russia. The meaning is here that there is no border of the Russian state, but all the Russian or Slavonic speaking people, all the Orthodox people, and the people who can fight for the Holy Russia is a holy people. This idea comes from the most famous intellectual today. His name is Dugin, Alexander Dugin, and this man is a main supplier, probably, the Putin's religious or the state policy with Ukraine. Yeah. Thank you.
You know, I think about war, and I think about how preeminent it seems today, wherever you look. And not to drag, Washington back into this, but Thomas Jefferson and Washington, they looked at Europe in the 1700s as a continent that was beset with war. And they came to the conclusion that the only hope for peace was to find some other way to organize an entity that could transcend everything that had caused war up until that point. And Jefferson, especially, was very fond of talking about the idea of freedom being something that you could literally make an empire out of. Yeah, I don't want to use the word nation because since the 1800s, nation has meant something else. But Jefferson had this idea that you could make a state of vastly different people as long as everyone was dedicated to freedom. And when I think about nationalism today, and I think about borders today, are we supposed to be hopeful or hopeless? I get kind of hopeless because I think, what's it going to take to redraw all these borders in a more natural way in which fighting will not be the primary action across them? I don't think Jefferson was right that today we can have an ideology of freedom that makes somebody into one thing. Is there something else today that we could grab onto?
Just going back to this book, his argument is that we need, above all national states, to return to the importance of the United Nations, to be a governing organization to which all the different states can relate on an equal level. So it's in a way replacing the Jefferson thing of freedom, but something represented by the United Nations. So I recommend, it's Richard Sakwa, The Lost Peace. That is his argument.
Yeah, every time I think about collective security in the United Nations, I sort of waver between hopefulness and hopelessness. And it depends on what day of the week you catch me, I think, as to what mood I'm mostly in. But my sense is that something along those lines needs to set in. George?
Right, thanks. So I'm going to sort of chime in on the idea of borders and what borders have done. And I think that borders have actually exacerbated the level of conflicts and wars that we have. Now, if you look at Europe, when mainland Europe, starting from the 1960s, the European Union, and then sort of progressively move into what you now call the EU, right? So you see that mainland Europe, it's a borderless space.
The idea of it is certainly borderless.
Yeah, the idea of it is borderless. And you need to stop for a second and ask yourself, why don't we have wars and conflicts in mainland Europe? What do you call, the borderless Europe? And then we have wars in Eastern Europe, right? And then we have wars in the Middle East and in all the places where there are borders. And by the way, it's interesting that when the French administered the African colonies, all of French West Africa was one political entity, which is today about 10 countries. So all of French West Africa was one political entity. All of French Central Africa was one political entity. And there were no wars. Remember, borders create imaginary differences and issues. So all of France, but then when France was decolonizing, when France was giving independence to its former colonies, France decided to bifurcate them and then create very stiff borders between them. And so that's why now you see there's a lot of wars and conflicts in between these different. So just imagine that if the 10 French West African colonies, if they had attained independence as a single political entity, which was the arrangement that France had when they were a colony, it's more than likely that we would not be having all these sort of crises and conflicts within them.
Are we just conditioned by our globes and our maps then to think that that sort of difference is inevitable and that those differences would not be there if all of French West Africa were one political entity?
So here's my response. Okay, look at the United States of America, for example, of 50 states. When the U.S. originally attained independence, there were just 13 colonies in 1781. And then between 1781 to 1760, the U.S. had then incorporated all these other states, and today we have 50 states. And the U.S., notwithstanding the political wrangling, rhetoric, and stuff like that.
Like the Civil War?
Yeah. But then since the Civil War, 1865, take from 1865 to now, that's almost 200 years. Mm-hmm. The U.S. is way more politically stable in terms of not having wars compared to other political entities that have huge borders amongst them. Now, and I'm also going to say this. The idea of, because in recent times, certain states or nations, especially the richer nations are tightening borders. And as they're tightening borders, this tightening of borders is also happening simultaneously with sort of further discrepancy or inequalities between the richer nations and then the poorer nations. Mm. And so there is a way that tightening of borders sort of constrive people within the poorer nations, and has a way that it sort of unleashes social tensions, social, economic, and financial tensions that then become an integral part of the armed conflicts that are happening. Mm-hmm. So I think the evidence points to the fact that borders have caused way more problems than they have actually solved.
Yeah. Joanne, does the same thing hold true in the Middle East, do you think?
Well, that is an interesting question. Some of the same dynamics are at play in the sense that borders may not have been appreciated, particularly in the way they were drawn. And every school child in the Middle East knows that they don't like the Sykes-Picot Agreement, even though most Americans would have no idea what that is. I do think that the need for an administrative mechanism, who is responsible for making sure that school teachers get paid in this area versus that one, requires some sort of delineation of territory. The problem, as I see it, and I'm interested if this is where you're going as well, is when we said within this territory, we are a better people than those outside the territory, rather than different. Because difference is interesting, right? We want to go across the border to explore other places because they're cool and they're different. When we start saying, we within our border hold all that is good and true, therefore anything we do in relation to other states is justified even if those other people don't like it. I mean, one of the problems that I think we do have when we look at ourselves as the United States is we have an image, and this is going back to what you were talking about, an image of creating a state, a nation, a body that was built on a different kind of conception. But at the same time, we have to recognize that that conception did not hold true for most of the people in the country. Right. And our process of spreading and becoming 50 states was a state of fairly constant war. We don't think of it that way because we won, but it was a state of constant war. So how do we look at states in terms of the value of having a cohesion, an identity, a way of relating to other people, and yet avoid, we deserve rights, you don't? Because going back to your original question of, is there another way of viewing this? The concept of human dignity, I think, is a good touch point that kind of ties into the United Nations, ties into various other kinds of organizations based on the intrinsic value of people, rather than within our borders we are better, more deserving than other people are. When we look at human dignity as opposed to simply we deserve more, we are more likely to try and redress some of the inequities that unfortunately are being exacerbated in the world today.
Yeah, one of the things I'm sort of fond of telling my students is you have to decide whether you believe in human rights or not. Mm-hmm. And if you do, then a whole bunch of stuff is going to have to flow from that decision. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I noticed that Kathy's ominously standing up over there. Is it 10 o'clock already?
Well, it's getting close.
Oh, my goodness.
It's close to 10 o'clock, and I'd like to have
Is it dark outside?
for some questions.
Yes, them.
And,
That's right.
We may have some in our chat on Zoom, but, okay, anybody have a question? This has been a very thoughtful.
I knew Joey would.
Should we throw the security microphone at him?
No, I get, okay, you get to throw it. Oh, I'm not a good thrower.
Then now does he gets to throw it to the next person, right?
That's fun.
Yeah, right.
Wait, so do I just talk into? Oh, cool. That's scary. So, I think it's true to a sense whenever you're speaking how maybe borders bring more conflicts than we actually think. But then I look at the region of, like South America, and there's all these like Spanish-speaking countries. There's Brazil, and there's quite a few countries in that region. But I feel like the amount of wars that have happened in South America, especially for its size, has been pretty like remarkably low. There's been a couple of regional conflicts. There's been border disputes, maybe between Chile and Argentina. The most recent conflict I can think of in South America was maybe over the Falkland Islands. And I was maybe wondering if any input from you guys for why that might be in South America and how they've been able to avoid so many different wars. Oh, do I throw this back?
Is this on? Oh, okay. I'm going to provide, yeah. I think I'm going to provide but a historical and a comparative answer to that question. Why is it that in South America, much of it, we don't have wars, or the amount of wars that we have relatively small compared to Africa, for example? That has to do with the nature of the attainment of independence for South American countries and the role of the US. One of the major last wars that was fought between the US and the Spaniards was in 1899, which was the US-Spaniards War. Which part of that war was about sort of the U.S. trying to define some sort of hegemony, sort of assert itself within the American continent, that Europe cannot just do in the American continent as it pleases, whether it's in North America or is in South America. So since the departure of colonialism in the Americas, Europe has not had the kind of influence over its former South American colonies that it does have over its other colonies, say in Africa, for example. So that's a comparative way in which I'll answer that question. And then I would just sort of cap it up by saying that many of the wars that are happening in Africa, like I said, not too long ago, do have sort of international dynamics or sort of metrics in how you understand them. Because you have very huge presence of European powers and European troops and forces in Africa. Even as I speak to you right now, the U.S. has almost 7,000 troops in Africa, many of them concentrated in West Africa. There are at least almost 2,000 U.S. troops in the small West African region, around the Sahel region. But before that, France has been having tens of thousands of troops within those regions. And it happens that those regions are the regions that are most affected by wars.
Okay, another question to Josh.
I just would love to get your guys' thoughts on colonialism and the impact that it has had on Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam, right? The French colonized Vietnam, and violence really showed up predominantly in the 20th century, with the U.S. getting involved later on. So you had mentioned French West Africa as an example of how the French were able to keep peace in a relatively large area. How did that differ within Vietnam? Because the Vietnamese people quickly rose up against the French colonizers. So I just would love to get your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Right. Thanks. Once again, because what then used to be known as French Indochina, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, when France, that area became the epic center of the Cold War in a way that much of Africa never became. So that sort of vacuum, as soon as France was tossed out of Indochina, especially the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, when the French were very violently pushed out, that vacuum gets filled by the US power. And that is how you get the US that gets involved in the Vietnam War from 1957 for the next, up to 1970. Because so the US has been very much in control, of those areas, all in the name of the Cold War. So that would make it very much different from Africa, where French forces in particular are very much hugely present in the former African colonies, and you wouldn't have them in Vietnam.
Do we have any questions from the chat?
There's one behind the...
Okay, we have one. I can't see that. Where's our cat?
Oh, I can't throw that.
Well, you can throw it in stages.
Okay, toss it back to that guy.
Pass it on. Well,
Okay.
We're going to have a touchdown. All right. This question's
we've got
towards-
NBA scouts in the audience.
Touche. This question's towards all of you. I've been hearing a little bit about the borders, a lot about colonialism too. And I mean, I do come from the Balkans, so as you mentioned, the Balkans, interesting place. I was curious to see, and especially as well with the Russian history and how religion plays a role into it, and what's the hegemony of those states. As far as from my understanding, I have two questions. So in Africa, throughout those, let's say, post-colonial regions, what exactly were the national sentiments? Because I know for a fact in northeastern Africa, mostly you had the Amazigh peoples who don't have a state. So then you also, that's also something, and then you have an ethnogenesis of so many different states like Gabon, like Burkina Faso, that just, I've asked a few people that have come from there, there's a very big diversity, which begs the question, what exactly unites them? What caused the ethnogenesis? And at the same time, going with the Balkans, those regions, while they may not have been, as natural borders, the mountains, and I also come from my ancestors are from Pontus, so Pontic Greeks. I mean, we come from the same mountains. So those places, while the geography was not definitive, it did play a pretty significant role into establishing that form of identity. So what exactly is the remedy when you have states like Turkey that override and commit a pretty big genocide and take over ancestral lands? Do we just erase and eliminate that let's say, ambition? I mean, I have my own personal ambition. I know that sounds a little too nationalistic, not a more patriotic ambition, but how do we eliminate or negate those ambitions, and especially in that context of having new states?
Okay, we need to make this fairly quickly, so we're going to pass them down, but let's make it succinct.
Do I stand up here, though?
I want to speak up, actually, for the individuality of nations. The individuality of each one of us is so valuable and exciting. I think you pointed out that it adds delight and interest to human life, the differences between one nation and another. Therefore, I want to sort of stand up for the positive side of nationalism. I suppose it's to do with the changing of the human heart to move from antipathy to respect to acceptance. My own name comes from hospitality, philoxenia. It is a profound spiritual and psychological change that needs to take place in the human being and then get transferred to the level of state, to politics. But I think basically it is a profound psychological side of human life.
I think the nationality can be the broader concept, but in the context of Russia, then the context of we are talking about, I think the religion and as a religious identity is the most important one. So recently, the theologian, which is the most distinguished theologian in the Orthodox Church, it belonged to the Russian Orthodox Church. His name is Father Kirill Hovorun. He argued that religion is so important in the war in Russia and Ukraine, and without religion, that war would not be happened. So I do agree with this statement because this is something very, very important identity of the nationality, national identity of Russia.
Very quickly, when we look at the Middle East, people tend to think about, well, it's all about religion, and there are lots of different religious groups, and they're all mixed up. I think that we need to separate religious identity from religious belief, because there are many groups that will see themselves as being one religion and therefore against another, and that's not about faith. That's about identity. And claiming God as your reason for going to war is usually dangerous. Just a quick thing on mountains as borders, you look at Lebanon, where the mountain is the core of the country. Other places, mountains are seen as dividing. It's an accident of history. Speaking of history, all of the stuff we're talking about how do you forgive, how do you forget, it all depends on where you decide history starts.
Right. I will just quickly respond to your question about what are the national sentiments. The national sentiments have been sort of very anti-French sentiments and this is for the masses. This is not for the corrupt, politicians. This is for the masses. And if you look at Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, they sort of just recently severed diplomatic relations with France. And I will give you this short analogy. The situation and the relationship between France and its former African colonies would be comparable to the Judea that Jesus met in Matthew and Mark, where Jesus looked at the people of Judea, he looked at the Pharisees, he looked at the Sadducees, he looked at the scribes, and he said they were corrupt politicians. But at the same time, he said they were corrupt politicians because they were supported and protected by absentee landlords. And who were those absentee landlords? They were the political leaders of the Roman Empire, which happened to be thousands of miles away from Judea.
Thank you. You want to pass it back? Dr.
I can catch, I can't throw.
Dr. Smith, do you
Yes.
have a closing word for us?
I've thought about that, and I mean, I have a lot of words, but they're not really closing words. I don't know how to offer closure to this question.
I'm going to say some thanks, and then I'm going to offer a closing word.
Well, there you go.
Thank you so much for moderating our panel. Didn't they do a great job? This was wonderful. I do wish we had another 10 hours to visit. Thank you for your thoughtful perspectives. And we're very grateful to those who co-sponsored today's event: International Studies, the J.M. Dawson Institute of Church-State Studies, the Departments of Modern Languages and Cultures, History, Religion, and of course, Dean Archer and our Baylor University libraries. Thank you for being here today. And of course, like any event, it wouldn't have been possible without our technical folks. Thank you, Andrew Tellep, Stephen Neves, Troy Shaw, and those myriad of details that you all have handled, as well as Janelle Wellbaum, Charles Howard, the Library Board of Advisors, Nancy Jackson and Gloria Dubose for helping with our refreshments, which, by the way, we have refreshments, and you can converse with these panelists during our conversation and refreshment time. And so I'm going to ask you to leave with a scripture on your hearts. It's found in Micah 6:8, a very familiar scripture. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? I think we've said that's the hope that we have if we all do that together. Thank you for coming.